Hey! What are you doing? Nothing, just thinking. What about? Your Roman Empire? Yeah, the Roman Empire. Wait, your Roman Empire is the Roman Empire?
قدامك esse, gloria urbi eterna, et ultimo eius heroi, Gaius Julius Caesar.
We have all heard of the man, or at the very least of his legend. The man who, inspired by Alexander of Macedon, decided his life's work would surpass even that of his hero. Welcome, Civ fans and history nerds, to the second episode of Meet Your Leaders. Alright everyone, grab a drink, take a seat. We're about to dive deep into the story of one of humanity's most influential characters, the Caesar.
Hail Caesar, general, patrician, and dictator of Rome. Your people and your ambition call to you across the ages. The die is cast, and let none stand against your vision, whether they be your bitter foes or your closest friends.
Born on the 12th or 13th of Quintilis in the year 100 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar was born into the Julii Caesaris family, a line of patricians, the original Roman nobles, who trace their lineage back to the goddess Venus. Politics in the times of the Roman Republic were heavily influenced by an oligarchy-like society of patricians who could insert themselves into the positions of public service by utilizing their wealth and influence, both of which had, by the start of the 2nd century BCE, after Rome's victory over Carthage in the Second Punic War, extended to all over the Mediterranean basin. This overreach and power by the noble ruling class had earned them a lot of enemies all over the Greco-Roman world, making the huge pool of military conscripted peasants the most likely instrument for a change in the status quo.
Wink, wink.
Though noble in lineage, the Julii Caesaris had, despite having had a couple of relatives in the consul positions, mostly aligned themselves with the anti-nobility movement. It is in this climate that our protagonist is born. Mayhaps lacking the backing he would have required for an easier political career, Kaiser decided to pursue public life. In 84 BCE, being merely a teenager, he married Cornelia, daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who would later become a defeated rebel leader from the First Roman Civil War. A year later, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the victor of said war and subsequent dictator of Rome, ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. Caesar refused and left Italy to do military service in the provinces of Asia and Cilicia. 9 years later, in 75 BCE, following a short stint back in Rome after the death of Sulla, the 25-year-old Kaiser traveled to Rhodes, the city of the Colossus, to study oratory under Professor Molon. However, he was captured by pirates en route. Plutarch's Parallel Lives tale recounts Caesar being incensed by the 20 talents ransom they were demanding for his release, calling them pathetic and mocking them by saying that they would have demanded up to 50 if they knew who they had captured. While Caesar's retinue gathered the ransom, he bossed around his captives, speaking to them as if he were in charge, commanding their silence so he could sleep, mocking them as illiterates when they wouldn't appreciate his poetry, even joking about having them crucified once he got released. 38 days later, the ransom arrived. Testament to the love and admiration Kaiser already inspired, his retinue was able to muster a fleet in the city of Miletus, where certain Thals lived, and return to capture the pirates, who were still on the same island they held them on. When the governor of the province of Asia seemed lenient on their punishment, Kaiser took matters into his own hands and made good on his
joke.
A year later, in 74 BCE, Kaiser raised a private army to crush the rebellion of the king of Pontus, Mithridates VI Europator, against Rome. In the following years, Kaiser made a key acquaintance, Gnaeus Pompeius, aka Pompey, with whom he worked to undo the constitutional changes brought by Sulla, the first dictator of Rome. Funnily enough, Pompey began his career as a lieutenant of Sulla's, but turned cloak on him after his death. Wonder if this can be foreshadowing for something.
Wink, wink.
Now here comes the famous tale. A few years later, with Kaiser in his early 30s, Alexander of Macedon, his lifelong hero and inspiration, came back to haunt him. In 68 BCE, while Kaiser served as quaestor, position in which he was basically in charge of all financial operations of the province of Farther Spain, modern-day Andalusia and southern Portugal, he visited a temple to Hercules in Gades, modern-day Cadiz, and saw a statue of Alexander the Great. Kaiser was distraught. By his age, Alexander had already conquered all the known world. He had avenged the Greek world by eradicating Achaemenid Persia. He conquered Babylonia, a feat that only Cyrus the Great, a Persian leader who Alexander himself admired, could accomplish. He achieved what no one before him could: conquered the ancient empire of the Nile. After Alexander's death, at the age of 32, entire dynasties emerged claiming direct heritage from him. The Macedonian king became the West's first outright superhero, an unmatched military genius, a god king, a larger-than-life character, Kaiser's idol. Following his tenure in Farther Spain, in 59 BCE, Kaiser returned to Rome and rose to the position of consul. Shortly after, he established the first triumvirate with himself, Pompey, and Crassus, a fellow army man and good-standing public servant of Rome. This coalition of power became almost all-encompassing in the Greco-Roman world. Also, during this time, Kaiser remarried. This time, his bride was Pompeia, the distant relative of his ally Pompey. With their help, and throughout the decades, Kaiser was able to gain the administration of the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, southernmost France, and later Transalpine Gaul, the rest of France, all of Belgium, and the parts of Germany west of the Rhine, whereas Pompey was tasked with bringing back the order to the eastern provinces. The real price of governorship, however, lied in the total freedom to administrate the resources therein. Iberia was not a problem at all, since most of the infrastructure required to rule it had been laid by the Carthaginians centuries earlier. But when it came to Gaul, Kaiser would have to flex his martial muscles to carry out what became one of the most influential military victories in Roman history. The lands beyond the Alps and west of the Rhine were inhabited by mostly disorganized yet fierce and numerous tribes. Long story short, after 8 years of fighting from 58 to 50 BCE, Kaiser was able to pacify them so thoroughly that Gaul would remain firmly under Rome's grasp for centuries to come. Despite being busy administrating his provinces, Kaiser never ceased to bolster his position at home. Nevertheless, exterior events crept on the cohesion of the triumvirate. Kaiser's and Pompey's family link broke in 54 BCE following the death of Julia, Kaiser's daughter, whom Pompey had married in 58 BCE. The other member, Crassus, who had been given governorship of Syria in 55 BCE, was eliminated by a ravaging Parthian invasion in 53 BCE. A couple of years later, at the start of 49 BCE, the bond between Kaiser and Pompey was forfeit. The latter had long sided with the Roman nobility in opposition to Kaiser and had been actively plotting to remove his public servant status to leave him unprotected, aka to be able to legally dispose of his former, now too strong, ally. In response to this, on January 10th or 11th, 49 BCE, Kaiser marched his armies across the Rubicon River, the natural border between his province, Cisalpine Gaul, and the Republic's domains, Italy proper, thus committing the first act of what became the Second Roman Civil War. The debate about which side was, let's not even say right, but some sort of the lesser evil for the course of history is fascinating to this day. On the one hand, the status quo was hardly hopeful. Centuries of patrician oligarchy centralized in Rome had dealt massive damage to the administration and prosperity of the Greco-Roman world. Widespread corruption and poverty brew a volatile society desperate for change. On the other hand, the champion of this change was a man of noble birth, who himself had acquired the necessary resources to threaten the system by playing into its flaws and vices. But that, because he knew precisely what needed to be done in order to bring it down and put himself on top. Despite what ended up happening, none of the involved parts, neither Caesar nor Pompey and the nobles at his side, were really wanted for war. Had things played out slightly differently, blood might not have even had to be shed. The circumstances, however, left the parties involved no real room for negotiation without significant loss to face. Kaiser could not have addressed his demands for a prolonged holding of his public office to a diametrically opposed faction of politicians who already feared the growth of his power and influence outside of the traditional system. So, where it was. Kaiser quickly rid Italy of his enemies. He crushed Pompey's forces in Spain, then crossed the Adriatic, and on August 9th, 48 BCE, met him again in Pharsalus. Pompey then fled Greece and sought refuge in Egypt, but was promptly murdered by an officer of King Ptolemy. Yes, from the Ptolemaic Greek dynasty, the one established in Egypt after Alexander's conquest by one of his generals. Kaiser, who had followed Pompey across the Mediterranean, wintered in Alexandria, where he spent some quality time with Queen Cleopatra, from which Caesarion was born in 47 BCE. He would later be killed at age 17 by Kaiser's adopted son Octavianus, later the first Roman Emperor Augustus, who was actually Caesar's great-nephew, the grandson of his sister Julia. A year later, in 47 BCE, Kaiser briefly returned to northeastern Anatolia to crush the rebellion of King Pharnaces of the Cimmerian Bosphorus, who tried to reclaim Pontus, the king his father Mithridates had lost to Kaiser himself in an uprising 26 years before. It is actually from this brief campaign that Caesar's most famous quote, "Veni, vidi, vici," originated from. After this short detour, Kaiser returned to Rome to claim his title as Imperator. A few squabbles did arise in some corners of his new empire, but by 45 BCE, he alone stood as the victor of Rome's Second Civil War, and the most powerful man in the most powerful nation of the Western world. Sadly, on March 15, 44 BCE, during the Ides of March, and having had less than a year to establish his vision for a new regime, Kaiser was brutally assassinated in the theater of Pompey. His body is stabbed 23 times by enemies and allies alike. This abrupt end, however, was facilitated by probably the one flaw of Kaiser's as the player of the game he was. As demonstrated by his campaigns in Gaul, he had no qualms in being decisive and thorough when dealing with who he deemed barbarians. This ruthlessness, however, did not extend to the enemies at home. Perhaps too sympathetic to such measures by his early experiences with Lucius Sulla, whose fierce persecution of his domestic rivals had marked Caesar's life, he showed too much mercy to champions of the regime he had just brought down. This gives us Kaiser's second most famous quote, "Et tu, Brute," referring to former Republican enemy Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Kaiser had forgiven after claiming victory in the war, and had since become a close ally of his. Yet, there were also several former Caesarians behind his deadly conspiracy. His involvement is simply explained by either a dislike of Kaiser's monarchical tendencies, or by realizing that the system that had allowed Kaiser to better their fortunes was the very same they were working to destroy. Regardless, it was too late. The old world of the Republic had died. Kaiser would not have been able to kill it if it wasn't rotten to its core to begin with. Most crucially, the conspirators of Kaiser's murder failed to realize his value as a martyr. No one can really tell how long Kaiser would have lived on his own. His health was surprisingly good for a man in his 50s that had seen so much battle and traveled as much as he had, though sources do note he suffered a handful of epilepsy attacks in his last years. What we do know is his legacy far exceeded that of any other Westerner before and since. In his time as Imperator, he reformatted the calendar to name a month after himself. You would never guess which. He also ordered the formerly razed settlements of Corinth and Carthage rebuilt, not wanting to let their potential remain wasted decades after they were made examples of. Furthermore, as a testament on how determined he was to make a splash in the world, we have his numerous authorial credits. He documented in real time many of his military campaigns, giving us literary works like Commentari di Bello Gallico, his recount on his activities in Gaul, Commentari di Bello Civili, on his victorious civil war, as well as his own autobiography, shedding light into how forward-thinking he actually was. However, beyond his military genius and brilliant mind for politics, His greatest and most fascinating legacy for me personally is the figure he became thanks to his chosen heir, Octavianus. Once the ascent to power of Kaiser's successor was secured in 27 BCE through his victory over Kaiser's assassins alongside the second triumvirate comprised of himself, Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, the now Emperor Augustus glorified the figure of his adoptive father Kaiser, elevating him to godlike status. From Augustus, and for centuries to come, despite the position technically remaining as Imperator, or He Who Commands, the official title for the emperors of Rome became none other than Kaiser. The name became so synonymous with the absolute power and godlike status of the rulers of the mightiest force in the West that centuries, even millennia, after the deaths of the people who elevated it, rulers from all over the Roman sphere of influence and beyond still tried to benefit from it by association. In the year 800 AD, Carolus Magnus was crowned Imperator Romanus Augustus, despite having been born close to a millennia after Kaiser and his legions ravaged through his future Frankish/Gallian homeland. The line of rulers he started carrying the title of Kaiser of the rather Germanic Holy Roman Empire, which is doubly ironic since the Germans were the peoples that famously Rome failed to bring into the fold for as long as it stood. Centuries later, following the fall of Constantinople in 1473, which also marked the death of the last remnant of the Roman Empire, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottomans gave himself the title Kaiser-i Rum, the Kaiser of Rome, as he had conquered the city that had for 1,000 years symbolically been the Second Rome. In the mid-16th century, the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan IV Vasilievich, branded himself Tsar, the Russification of Kaiser, of all Russias, title which in his context was meant to convey the ruler/sovereign of all the Russes, aka of all the kingdoms/city-states derived from the wider Kievan Rus cultural and geographic identity. In the late 1700s, when Napoleon Bonaparte grew to admire the life and work of Caesar to the point where he practically copied it to a T, he made himself a name as a fearsome general, fought with the people to topple a corrupt, decadent, established regime, navigated the relentless chaos that followed, and, through a combination of political maneuvering and military might, managed to land on top. Hell, he even made himself emperor once the dust has settled under his boot. In the mid-19th century, the brainchild of Otto von Bismarck, the German Empire chose Kaiser, the Germanification of Kaiser, as the title for Wilhelm of Prussia, the first proper German emperor, which is, incidentally, where Franz Beckenbauer got his iconic nickname, and, well, me from him. In the modern world, I find Kaiser to be an extremely interesting figure to analyze. He is either a brilliant visionary hero who brought down a broken and corrupt regime, or a Machiavellian corrupt demagogue dictator who toppled the status quo only to put himself on top. As always, the truth, I would argue, lies somewhere in the middle. A reliable fact is that Kaiser was a brilliant player of, if you would allow me the phrase, the Game of Thrones. He had the skill to navigate the system superbly enough to shatter it from within. He bossed the politics game, formed a solid base of key allies, raised a mighty, well-trained, but most importantly, extremely loyal army through merit and charisma, gathered riches and influences to sway key political decisions in his favor, like giving himself and his triumvirate allies the right over lands. Bottom line is, however, the system, the Roman Republic that had dethroned Carthage and the old Greek city-states to become the undisputed Mediterranean superpower, could not have been toppled by a single individual if it wasn't already rotten from the inside. Kaiser's name lives on to today, not the ones from the many senators that opposed and murdered him. His legacy, the greatest empire the Western world has ever seen, the unifying cultural force behind mighty empires and kingdoms that rose from the ashes of Rome. His lineage, well, hit or miss honestly. At the end of the day, Kaiser understood this. The dynasty starts after you, not with you. And what a glorious one it was. Alright everyone, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this recounting of the life of Julius Caesar. This has been a very interesting project. I have not produced a scripted video like this in a while. The script for this one was over 2,500 words long, so I really thought it was going to take a little longer to go through the entirety of it in, voicing it. But under 20 minutes is quite decent. This was a decent turnaround. If you came from the short, thank you so much. I hope you liked this version, this more developed, more detailed analysis of his story, or just, presenting the facts with some little glazing. And I hope you liked it. This is just episode 2 of Meet Your Leaders. I have some of the favorites lined up next. Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, and Cleopatra, Moctezuma, Tsarina Yekaterina, the ones from the intro. We might as well go through them sooner rather than later. Hope you liked the gameplay. This was not the original plan exactly. I had intended to use as background gameplay some Game of Civ I had streamed live in my Twitch channel, but I realized that it was kind of bad since I was still hellbent on from, as you saw in my previous video about how 99% of your Civ games go. I, for whatever reason, set myself to play a Faith opener with Caesar Rome, which is suboptimal, let's just say. I decided I might as well play another game, play to Caesar's strengths in Civ 6, which is, funnily enough, raiding barbarians to make yourself filthy rich. But yeah, this was more fitting, I'd say. And if you would be interested, I could upload the whole game. I did record the entirety of the game. I ended up winning a science victory, and it's like 5.5 hours long, the whole recording. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I know this is not exactly a Roman helm. This is more a Spartan helm. But fuck it, if Christopher Nolan can get away with using inaccurate armors, I might as well do so, right? Like, subscribe, follow me in my social media, all that algorithm jazz. And see you in the next one, lads. Bye bye.